Well, hello and good morning. Welcome to Mountain Standard Time. Of course, I'm your host, Nathan Gita. Today, I'll be speaking to Aaron Eckman, who's right next to me here, the former Secretary-Treasurer of the BC Federation of Labor. And a little bit later, we'll have Stuart Parker on, President of the Los Altos Institute. Do remember to like the Western Standard on Facebook and to be in order to be notified when we go live, and visit our website and take out a subscription to support us. Today's going to be a little bit different, as it'll be the first day of bringing on regular guests to the show. Of course, the big networks do this as well. It's a lot easier to run a show without having to find new guests for every single segment, every single week. But it is also important to start to build a coalition that might change things for the better. We're not going to get anywhere without our allies. Aaron and I already have a separate show called Ram and Stag, where we get into the BC political issues in depth. Today, we'll be doing a simple round of what's happening in the news, as well as some interpretation of current events. But more importantly, Aaron represents an odd-sounding point of view to some right-wing ears. He's a progressive, even a socialist at times, but pro-resource development, which is not familiar to the wokies and the far left. That actually has a broad base of support here in BC, and I'm just trying to explain this for the Albertans in the audience, because, of course, sometimes they think all of us BCers don't have a lot of sympathy for development, but that's not true. Lots of people here might have different values that are not as traditional, but the fact of the matter is that a lot of people understand too that it has to get paid for somehow. Actually, Darcy Rippon the other day made this very clear, explaining this. And so just to make that point, right, that the investment in vital infrastructure as well as the resource bases is vital to the carrying on of British Columbia. There isn't going to be a BC without there being BC trees, BC mining, and BC oil and gas. And then with regards to Mr. Parker a little bit later today, we have a man whose anti-woke stance is well appreciated on this show, and he can articulate in terms both the left understands and really that the right can understand as well, or at least hear it the first time. Again, one of the biggest issues facing us right now is our inability to communicate across the aisle. And nothing is going to get us to a better future faster than finding hitherto ignored people, cohorts of people who have no stake in the current political malaise, and gaining their trust and moving forward. So sit back, relax, and we'll begin to build the coalition for a better future. So welcome to the program again, Aaron.
Well, thanks for having me. It's I enjoy it. It's wonderful. I really enjoyed the show yesterday as well. Actually, it was good to see Darcy from Telco. He was a wonderful mayor, and I have to admit I sent them a little bit of money during the election because I was just so happy to see a political party representing Northern Interior interests in particular running in the provincial election. So
no, I completely agree. It's fundamentally, of course, we need more relevant political parties, period. This has been an ongoing problem in BC forever, but we also have dozens of political parties in BC. I don't know. I think there's like 16 Alberta independence parties, but like in BC, it's more like every single river valley has a party to fight over these things and get this stuff.
Yeah, people don't realize it, but BC's got like probably the largest number of, for lack of a better term, fringe parties.
Yes.
Probably any other province. And I like that. I've always liked that. And a lot of people are sort of annoyed by fringe parties, but I remember, being in high school when you remember in high school when they would always do the all candidates debates in your gymnasium back when we were allowed to, sit in the same room together, stuff like that. And I remember,
this is digital, by the way. We're both being digitally imposed.
We're actually we're not even in the same
really
place.
In the same room.
Yeah.
So
I'm
your
actually
microphone cord needs to be fixed.
I'm actually in Abbotsford, but through the miracle of modern technology, you can reach across the digital divide.
Exactly.
But no, I remember watching these debates, and like the Christian Heritage guy would always show up every year, and I always thought he was pretty interesting. And then I remember there was like the Flying Yoga Party or Flying Yogic Party, and their whole thing was they'd cross their legs and they'd sort of bounce really high, and they would field candidates. They might still be fielding candidates, but they would always show up to these things, and they would always sit right beside the Christian Heritage Party, and never before would you ever see two parties with more divergent political views. So it was always interesting. But this week in British Columbia was kind of interesting, I guess, if you like to watch and follow BC politics. There was we had a throne speech, and I don't know how many people pay attention to that, but it was they
were trying to outline what was going to be in the budget, but which we're not going to write, apparently. So there's a list of gimmies. So I don't know if we brought you up to speed on this. There's a list of gimmies in the budget, a whole bunch of things that are going to be in the budget, but there's not going to be any details about the actual costs, expenditures, projected revenues, projected everything. That's all gone. So I don't know what this really is anymore, more than like a memo. It's like, okay, so this is our Christmas wish list. These are some of the numbers we've used before in the past. We have no idea where any of the real numbers are. Don't ask. Here we go.
Yeah, it's like the budget speeches aren't. Others have said already this week that the budgets, or sorry, not the budget speech, the throne speeches aren't really what they used to be. They're a lot shorter now, and part of the, I heard, I think it was Kay McLean from the Orca who had commented that the last sort of long throne speeches that he recalls were from Gordon Campbell. Where he would deliver these really long speeches. It would lay out it's sort of in the BC tradition of what they're supposed to be. It's supposed to lay out the vision of government for that year. And then you compare it to the budget that they've released, so you can take a hard look at what they actually plan to pay for and how they plan to pay for it, which, doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you are. How you pay for it is the most important question. And because we all know that most politicians, they just like to wax on and eloquently about what they're going to do, and they make all these aspirational assertions without really backing up, and you need to see the budget to be able to tell. So there's no budget so far. I think it's coming out in a few days, but the big news a few weeks ago was that the finance minister in British Columbia just simply not done one, and the argument was, well, it's in the middle of COVID, so we just don't know how things are going to play out. And it's like, well, yeah, but also, like, in the private sector, they don't get to just like not do a budget, because
budget's going to balance itself.
Yeah,
right? That's fine. That'll be fine.
Can you imagine going to a board of directors, or if you have to go to shareholders or something, or even just your employees if you're a smaller business, and being like, well, we don't really know what this year is going to look like, so we're just not going to budget. I mean, can you imagine if individuals, ran their own household that way?
We used to have a joke about this going backwards, right? The joke, the opposite way, was from Monty Python, and they have this whole thing where, like, what did this firm make last year? We made a whole half penny, right? It's like, where's the other penny? I embezzled it, sir. You naughty person. So, like, this one accountant gets away with taking 1 penny out of the net profits, which is 50% of the profits of this firm. But the point is that, like, that's the joke back then. Nowadays, the joke is, hey, did you think about writing a budget? You crazy? I'm not writing a budget. Are you nuts?
Then they might see what we're doing. We don't want that. So yeah, no, it was just ridiculous watching them try to explain to British Columbians and the opposition parties why it was totally normal to not submit a budget prior to the throne speech. So you've got the lieutenant governor sitting in this chair delivering this speech that, of course, she didn't write. Which is par for the course. It's always been a bit awkward from my perspective to watch the lieutenant governor sort of, drone on about how wonderful the government is, and irrespective of which government it is, and there's nothing to point to. So it's just all of these aspirational sort of targets, and it was quite short because I guess the new thinking in this communications professional dominated politics is don't put anything of substance in the throne speech, because you're just giving material to the opposition parties to criticize. So
but there were still some substantive things in the throne speech here in British Columbia.
There was one piece that nobody has covered, and it was just, and I understand it was like the 67th paragraph on page 3, because it wasn't a long speech, and it mentioned shipbuilding and a proposal by the provincial government, which actually I thought was, I'm critical of all governments of all stripes. I've been particularly critical of the BC NDP government on a number of issues. But if any government gets up and says, look, we've got at least 1/2 of the longest coastline of any nation in the world,
on planet Earth.
Yeah. Why shouldn't we try to reinvigorate our shipbuilding industry? And so there's this little throwaway line in the throne speech saying we're going to try to reinvigorate the shipbuilding industry in British Columbia, but we're going to try to build the Arctic. We're going to, I guess, essentially lobby the federal government to build the Arctic icebreaker that they need here in British Columbia. Which, if there was any meat to that, I'd be jumping up and down over it. I mean, that for good reasons. I mean, happy jumps, because those are really good family supporting jobs. The kind of jobs which this province is just screaming out for. Now, most of them, of course, would probably be down in the lower mainland. I mean, there's some argument that we could build some capacity up near Rupert, maybe Kitimat, et cetera. But it's, I mean, the interesting take on this, I suppose, is that many will argue that the reason why the BC NDP is so hesitant to sort of get into this is that those who were around during the Glenn Clark government still feel the sting of the BC Ferry scandal and the cost overruns on that construction. But I was actually out of the country at the time. I was going to university in Japan, so I was sort of out of the communications bubble when all that was taking place. But I remember looking into BC from afar thinking, well, that's fantastic that they're building ferries at home. And I don't care much if they're spending more money than they budgeted on it. I worked for many years in construction, and I never worked on a job that came in under budget. I mean, like it's a scam really in construction is that
you bid
as low as possible.
Cost plus.
Well, I mean, you bid as low as you can because you've got 60 other bidders that are trying to get the job. So, and generally the rule of the day is you go with the lowest bidder. And then you get them on what they call extras, right?
Yeah.
And it ends up costing way more. So that was always...
Hey, that's almost like we sell cars.
Yeah. So, I mean, people could say, okay, well, that's fair enough. That's a private sector. We should be able to do that in the private sector, but government should be a bit clearer. That's fine. But the important piece in this is despite the cost overruns, it's the same reason I didn't criticize the BC Liberals when there were much larger cost overruns on the convention center and the replacement of the roof on BC Place, for instance, because that money's going to workers in British Columbia and they're not putting it in an offshore spending account somewhere. They're spending it, on toilet paper and the kind of things that you need for your family at home. So it supports small businesses. It's the kind of economic spinoff that helps communities, especially smaller ones in the interior. So if there's actually a genuine effort to try to rekindle the shipbuilding industry in British Columbia, that's fantastic. It's the kind of thing that a throne speech should actually be built around, because the sacrifice and the resources that are going to have to go into rebuilding a shipbuilding industry in British Columbia are immense. And this is why I'm a bit skeptical that anything's going to come of this, is that I just don't see the provincial government kind of getting behind this initiative as I think they need to. I mean, we have a skills deficiency. I mean, we shouldn't hide that. There's no reason why we should pretend we don't. We haven't been building ships for quite a while in British Columbia, despite the fact that we really should be. Even our warships, we have to go to that small island nation across the Atlantic to still build our warships for us. It's just ridiculous. We get the longest combined coastline on the planet.
And it's a vital industry, because I mean, until you get dirigibles delivering everything, and even then with a strong enough headwind, that's not going to work out. Fact of the matter is that ships are the way that we have to get places in this country. I mean, for goodness sakes, we used to have little tiny ships. They were called canoes, and that was how the fur trade ran. Then we get to the seaway, right, in the St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes, and slightly bigger ships, and then finally out to the sea.
We can't even keep foreign fishing boats out of our waters.
No, like we don't. Like our Coast Guard is, unfortunately, it's entirely undersupplied. Like all of the Canadian military, to be clear.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter what you're looking at the Canadian military. It's all undersupplied. But back to the point of BC shipbuilding, I think that this is just a real opportunity for Canada in general, and for BC in particular, that we could have a viable domestic industry right at a time when we need more jobs.
Yeah,
like people are devastated right now. Like, it's going really bad out there. And apparently harsher lockdown stuff is coming. We'll get to that a little bit later in this program. But I think, just as kind of an opening thought, it's like, at least let's think of solutions. And one of the solutions is projects that just get money out the door. You show up, you have a job, the money goes out the door. Yes, maybe it's government funded, but this has precedence before. And it's the way that somebody finally gets into a house. It's a way somebody finally pays off massive amount of student debt. Like, it's these stimulus moments that make all the difference in the world. And for people who just have a guaranteed income because they work in government, or they work in a big institution, they never have to worry about being fired, and they never think about going without their wanting or being hungry. It's things like this that really do shape people's lives. They really do take people from a very impoverished place and take them to a better place, because they just, for that 3, 4, 5 year period, they managed to get enough income that they could finally get into property, get into something, and move forward.
Well, and there's going to be lots of criticism on this. If they actually put any effort behind it, the regular critics, I think, would come out and say, well, look, it costs way more, probably twice as much to build a ship in British Columbia than it would, say, in the Ukraine, where we've had ferries built in the past, for instance. And at least for the beginning part of this initiative, that's absolutely true. But again, people have to remember, what's your goal? And I made this argument at the outset of the pandemic as well, both in the American case and in the Canadian context, when everybody at the federal government and the provincial government sort of wringing their hands about how they were going to try to get stimulus money to regular folks. They never really worry about this when they're giving money to big corporations, right? I mean, in the US, I mean, they like literally trillions of dollars just of taxpayer dollars just flying out the doors to private corporations with no condition whatsoever. But when they talk about giving money to working folks, it's all means tested, right? And so like there's all these conditions, and if you apply for it and then they decide later you didn't qualify for it, well, then they come back at you for it, and that can be very expensive. But what pisses me off so much is the government is quite happy to spend untold millions of dollars on the bureaucracy required to put hoops up for people to jump through to access these programs. They don't do the same thing for big business, but it totally betrays what their real goal is. Their goal is not to keep the economy going in a tough time when lockdowns are stifling all economic activity. Their goal is just to, I mean, basically to try to bribe voters, I guess, because if they were really concerned about keeping money floating through the economy, they wouldn't be spending time, resources, and manpower trying to determine whether you qualify for the amount. They'd just write, basically universal checks to people so that they could spend the money on the things they need. And that's the point. It's not the goal shouldn't be to try to stop people from falling into poverty because of the pandemic on an individual basis, according to all of these
testing.
Yeah. Like, if you tick all these boxes, you get your $1,200 check or whatever they're debating in the US.
6 months after you needed it.
Oh yeah. And then a year and a half after that, they decide, oh, well, actually you didn't qualify for it, so now you got to pay it all back, or a portion of it. It was just ridiculous. They really should have just cut the checks to these folks. And so that's the same challenge with the I think the criticism of the shipbuilding industry is it's going to cost more. But again, if the goal is to get money to circulate through the economy to try to fire it up again, it's these big, economists agree on this, whether they're sort of progressive or conservative. And there's more conservative economists, I would argue, than progressive economists, just kind of the way it is in that sector. But they all agree that these big public projects are what gets us out of really tough economic times, like the ones we're going through right now as a result of the pandemic and other things. This is one example, like Site C, like the Massey tunnel project that the current government has axed. These are the kind of projects that actually pull the economy out because they get money into the pockets of working people who then spend it locally at small businesses. It's just like, it's so simple. It just drives me crazy. But no, we're going to have to spend all this time and resource determining whether you qualify for the money or not. But this is the main point. If this government actually put some effort behind trying to rekindle the shipbuilding industry, we'd have reason to really get behind them on it, despite the criticism that's going to come from those who are just concerned about how to the dollar, how much tax dollars are going out to these kind of projects. So
and it's just a better thing to spend it on. There's a lot of useless things we spend money on all the time as government. Like, why can't we just spend it on something that might actually feed somebody?
Yeah, the only other thing out of the throne speech that was sort of interesting to me, because the rest of it was just kind of blah. Right after the throne speech, as we know, well, I won't ruin it yet, but right afterwards, the Speaker of the House, he asks the Premier if he had anything else to say after he made his comments following the throne speech, and Horgan stands up and he literally, this is a direct quote, he says, "Nah, that's all I got, man. That's it." And so Raj Chauhan, who's the Speaker of the House, he sort of looks at him and he's like, he sort of gives him a look. And Horgan's sort of looking around the chamber going, was there something else I'm supposed to do? And then somebody kind of slides him a piece of paper. We don't have to clip, but you got to go back to watch this. And he looks at it, he goes, "Oh yeah, right." And he stands up and then he gives like a 20 minutes, pre-written speech commemorating the death of Prince Philip, which he totally forgot. Right? I shouldn't be laughing, but
Jeremy Corbyn, eat your heart out.
That's all I got, man. That's it. What? It was like a Biden moment, right? It was almost like you could just see him falling up the stairs to the plane. It was kind of sad. And then so he's got this kind of like, "Hey dude, what's going on?" persona thing. And then he's like very solemn. Like, "Well, he was a great man, and we're very sorry about his passing."
We miss that the Queen's consort has gone away and gone to that further shore. Yeah. There's a way of doing that, I suppose, but a mention there from Norman about the Austrian school. I do prefer the Austrian school in a lot of ways, but I must admit that if I can finally kind of peg down my political beliefs on an economic side of things, we talked about this the other day. I am an anti-austerity conservative. Austerity doesn't work, loses us votes, and all it ever does is ensure that somehow there's always more managers and not enough frontline workers. And I'm done with austerity. So I'm not saying that means spend everything and sell the farm. But please do better with the revenues you already have as government, and don't just hire managers, frontline people in any government service is what's required. Very simple. I think it's, I don't know if there's an argument against that. Is there?
Yeah, I mean, I get the point Norman's making. It's I kind of come from the old, like, I've said this many times, it's starting to become a bit of a broken record, but I come from the old W.A.C. Bennett school of how you run a province. And for those of our Albertan friends who don't know, he was probably the most famous SOCRED premier of British Columbia, ruled for like, I don't know, it was like 20 years or something. And then
well, between him and his dad. Yeah.
Well, no, W.A.C. was the dad, and then it was his son, Brad, right?
That's right, Brad.
Who ruled for, another, I don't know, it was over 10 years. So it was like this almost 40-year dynasty of the Bennett family. And, like he had this hyper conservative caucus, but he pulled off the most socialistic caper in the history of British Columbia, where he took our private electric company utility and nationalized it and turned it over to British Columbians, and in the form of BC Hydro. It's a shell of its former self for reasons we won't get into today, but it really sort of created the foundation for economic sustainability for British Columbia, given that it's a resource dependent economy and has been traditionally, which is, similar to Alberta. And in fact, what we see happening in Alberta right now, part of the reason why I've got so much sympathy for our friends in Alberta, despite, the fact that most of the people that walk in the political circles I do don't, is that we've gone through the same thing in British Columbia. And I remember even talking to some of my cousins and family members who went out to Alberta saying, I get that oil's kind of humming right now and you're inviting everybody to come work because there's lots of work, but you both on a personal level and on a provincial level, you have to diversify your economy, because if our experience is instructive in any respect, the bottom can fall out of that resource industry like overnight. And it doesn't matter whether what the environmentalists are saying about the supply is bunk from your perspective. The commodity prices can drop. The fact that you haven't got enough refineries, for instance, can be challenging. And that's precisely absolutely what happened in British Columbia. So it's part of the reason I think why economists, even those that are really committed to private sector involvement, tend to agree that mega projects generally don't get started without significant public intervention, because most private firms don't have the kind of money required to build the Site C dam and expose themselves to that kind of risk. So you have to have, but then the other side of that is, once you've built it, who owns it and where does the money go? And we can debate that. My take on it is, well, it should be us. It should be taxpayers.
Well, so this is a funny point that I would make, is that, for me specifically, when it came to is it the Patel Bridge? No, not the Iron Workers Bridge. What's the first bridge coming out of Surrey into Vancouver when you cross the river?
Oh,
what bridge is that?
Yeah, maybe somebody in the chat can tell us. Yeah, we're definitely, we're interior boys.
Yeah, we've forgotten what's happening down there. The point is that they built the new bridge and they put in a toll. And the Port Man. Yeah, the Port Man. Sorry. And I had a lot of objections to that. And the reason I had objections to that, other than it being the Queen's Highway and lots of other rules about toll roads, is that my government underwrote the company that built it. Like, there's no way that company could have afforded to build it.
That's right.
Without the government saying, "Oh yeah, no, we will guarantee you. Don't worry, we will make sure you have enough slush to get this done." Well, God bless them for building it, but I don't understand why I'm paying a toll on it when clearly I already underwrote you through my tax dollars, through my government, to do it. So it doesn't mean there shouldn't be some kind of revenue capture in some other ways. Maybe it should be the gas tax. I don't know. But the point is that this was nonsense, and I hated paying that.
No, I diverged from all my lefty friends on this issue big time back when it was being discussed, because when the NDP came in and removed the tolls off that bridge, it was the left basically that criticized them on it, and you start to ask them about it, and it was like, well, we just think that if you toll the bridge, it discourages people from driving their cars, which is what we want to do because there's too many cars on the road. It's like. Do you guys even realize that the majority of people that are coming into Vancouver in the morning are working people that are coming to serve you your coffee at Starbucks every day, but they can't afford to live there, so they have to drive in, and
up to 2 hours.
And it didn't restrict traffic. It just diverted it through New Westminster, which created all sorts of infrastructural costs for that municipality. So it was a way for the province to download road maintenance to the municipality, because it was off the highways and into. Through this tiny little bridge in New West that was just teetering back and forth because these big trucks were going across it. It was just ridiculous. So yeah, anyway, we digress.
Yeah.
What else happened in the House this week? Well,
there was a new Minister of Youth. I guess we can go down.
Well, we can, sure. Let's talk about that now. So I think we even have a clip of the announcement here. So Brittany Anderson, probably a name that nobody's heard before, and that's understandable. Nothing against her, but she's a rookie MLA out of Nelson Creston, which is a riding I have a soft spot for. I went to high school in Nelson, which is part of the reason I ended up as left wing as I am, I suppose. And she replaces Michelle Mungal, who was an interesting character. She came in, I think she actually was originally from Alberta, ended up on the city council in Nelson, and then became an MLA. And she's notable because prior to the 2017 election, amongst the NDP caucus, who was opposition at the time, Michelle Mungal had taken one of the staunchest anti-Site C stances and was really opposed to mining and that kind of thing. And so what was so interesting was when the cabinet shuffle, or the first cabinet appointments after the 2017 election came around, it was fascinating to see that Premier Horgan, the new premier, made Michelle Mungal the Minister of Mines, Energy and Mines. This person who had been a critic, totally opposed to Site C, was now responsible for Site C and mines. And, you know, I mean, people on the right probably thought, oh, that's the clearest indication they're going to try to shut down all the mining and shut down Site. That's not what it was, I think. I think it was like, you can always tell who the premier likes and who they see as a potential threat or who they find to be annoying, because they make cabinet appointments based on, like, is this person going to survive this term? And so if you take somebody who's been really critical, and you know that there's all these clips out in the wild of them saying, you know, Site C should be canceled and mining is terrible, and then you make them a minister of that, like, their whole support base is going to fade away. And consequently, you know, I mean, I think she's probably got her own reasons, but Michelle Mungal is no longer, and Nelson Creston's a pretty tight riding. So flash forward, Brittany Anderson steps into the role. I guess she's pretty young. She got elected. I don't know how close it was. I didn't look at it. But I just saw this announcement the other day that she's now the premier's advisor on youth issues or something like that. And the announcement, if you pull it up, it says something to the effect of, you know, 7 of the MLAs in caucus are millennials. And like, is it just a coincidence that a week or so after Horgan comes under so much heat for basically blaming the deaths of the pandemic on this generation, decides he needs a youth advisor? And I thought maybe nobody, like, it didn't get a lot of news because, I mean, who cares, right? But it just, I was thinking to myself, like, what do their meetings look like? Like, is Horgan sitting around, you know, at his desk, and he calls Brittany in and he's like, so, you know, what's up with the youth today? What are the youths thinking?
The youths,
or how could I be more lit? The
littest.
I mean, did they make this decision because they recognize that this core demographic is not too happy with where they're going? Or, like, I don't know what she's going to advise them on. Like, is she the prime meme advisor? I don't know.
Yeah, no, she interprets the memes for him. That probably makes sense. That and the cat videos.
I mean,
GIFs. Like, what is a GIF? Is it a GIF? Is it a GIF? She helps him with that.
Yeah, that's right. You're younger than I am. I mean, maybe, like, you're a young person. Maybe.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe you're
31. That's like, young nowadays, right?
Like, what are you might be younger. I'm not sure what her age is, but like what are the issues that transcend all the different demographics within youth? Like, what would a youth advisor advise the premier on? I don't really.
The only thing at this point for anybody,
more skate parks. I don't know.
I think the joke is that, like, right between, you know, well, just younger than you, all the way down to basic. Well, I mean, I guess as of 2020, the eldest millennial was 38 as of 2020, because millennials are counted from 1982 forward, because they turned 18 on the millennium. That's why they're called millennials.
Right.
So they're counted from there forward. And then you have Gen Y right behind me, or right in between, which would be people from kind of 94, more like 95 onwards. Like, they were adolescents when the iPhone came out. So that was 2008. And then you have Gen Z, which has in their sentient life never not known instant communication and smartphones.
Well, you know this very well. I mean, you'd make a great youth advisor.
Well, there you go. Maybe they should hire me. I mean, I guess I just have to get elected in Nelson Creston.
But it was just clearly like,
surely if she's going to retire soon, maybe she needs a replacement. I'm sure she'd love to replace herself.
Yeah, maybe. So I don't know. It was just fun. It was clearly just one of those appointments that you sort of make up because you got to give this person something. I don't know. I guess there was a recognized need that they needed to elevate the person in Nelson Creston, because it's a tight riding. The Liberals could literally take it, I think, any election. So, and it's swung back and forth over the years. So we'll see how she does.
That happened with Dan's writing, right? Like, Dan, what am I thinking of? Dan
Davies?
Dan Davies.
No, that's never moved.
No, the guy in he's
Ashton?
in the Kootenai too. Yeah,
Penticton.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one can swing. Oh, that did swing this time, didn't it?
It stayed here this time, but I mean, it stayed blue this time, but I mean, it was in 2017 that it swung, I think.
No, I think Ashton's been there the whole time. We can check.
Yeah,
but
well, we'll find that.
Our producers taking a look. I think
actually, speaking of our producer, he reminded me that next week we're going to be talking to some people about the SoCred movement. So we're going to be talking about social credit. Cool. So we're going to do some recordings over with somebody who knows that really well and can give us some direction on it. So people who are interested in learning more about social credit, we'll be doing a feature on that next week.
That's cool. So the other things kind of going on in the provincial legislature right now, there's a couple of ministers that are under a disproportionate amount of heat, I guess, because of what's happening. The first is Ravi Kahlon. I can't remember the name of his ministry. It's like the Ministry of Jobs and Training, and I think it was the one that used to be Bruce Ralston's ministry. And so there's the opposition's really focusing in on what they perceive to be the lack of support that's been given to small businesses, and in particular, the difficulty that a lot of small businesses are facing in trying to access some of the funds that are available because of COVID, et cetera, to support them. And, it's like, it's interesting because it's predictable, I guess, that the BC Liberals would really hone in on this particular issue. But I think there's a huge missed opportunity here. And this is also related to the air tax, which we'll talk about in a bit. But, I think there's a lot of working people that are hurting. Like, the majority of people in British Columbia don't own a business. And they're hurting just as bad. And so when you see an opposition party that's putting all of their eggs into this particular basket of giving support to small businesses, you sort of miss out on this opportunity of advocating for working people that are having to go through all the same kind of garbage to get any sort of to get any sort of support. And so it's interesting to see that play out. Sheila Malcolmson, who's the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, is just in question period yesterday, she's under probably the most fire, and it's understandable. It's now, I think it was the 5-year anniversary of BC having declared a state of emergency in relation to the opioid crisis. There is, and so all the numbers came out, and it looks like on average in British Columbia, 5 people die a day of an overdose. I didn't quite realize that. I remember seeing the stats just over, I think, over the previous summer from last year, of the number, just as COVID was starting to hit its first wave, the number of opioid deaths just in Prince George outpaced COVID deaths by quite a margin. So that's sort of the underlying narrative that's been playing out in British Columbia since the pandemic began, which is, we've responded so strongly in terms of lockdowns, et cetera, and restaurant closures and all sorts of closures. And yet, the opioid crisis is claiming way more people. At 5 deaths a day is a staggering number for a province the size of British Columbia. And so the opposition, rightfully so, are hammering away at this. And the NDP, they haven't got much of a response other than, it wasn't really any better when you guys were in power. And then just to sort of reiterate that, there's more to do. But, I'm not really sure. This is a tough issue. And I know that across the political divide, people approach this differently. In British Columbia and Vancouver in particular has really kind of led the way on safe injection sites. I was listening to the news on the way over. Just in Prince George alone, there were 2 people outside of the closest thing we have to a safe injection site here in Prince George who had overdosed right outside of that place, but not from injected drugs. It was actually from smoking drugs. I'm not sure what they're smoking, but apparently there's this rise in opioid deaths from smoking rather than injecting. So these injection sites are now having to try to take into account whether or not they should be supervising the inhalation of drugs as well, which would be, I don't know how you would do that in a safe environment. It
would have to be vented.
You'd think so, right? Like you'd have to get some kind of ventilation so that the people observing them aren't inhaling this stuff. But that's one of the challenges that they're now having to face. And of course, in British Columbia in particular, the side that is totally opposed to safe injection sites is probably smaller than in other jurisdictions. Even the Vancouver City Police, for instance, were notably longtime supporters of safe injection sites because they figured it was actually like one way to try to mitigate the challenges of this stuff. And then the number of, they're the folks that are literally in conjunction with the paramedics and the first responders, picking these people up off the street and taking them to the morgue. I mean, like, and it's just this constant revolving door of folks that are overdosing. So it's like, again, it's one of those ministries. I was just thinking, as I was watching Question Period yesterday, it's always been MCFD that's been the ministry that nobody wanted to go into, because that was the kiss of death, right? Kind of like I was saying at the outset, when they put Michelle Mungal into the Energy and Mines ministry, it was probably to ensure that, like, you know, she wasn't going to go anywhere after that, right? And that was basically what you do with MCFD, and the BC Liberals used to do this as well. I think this is how Pollock ended up there. I think she was seen as a bit of a leadership threat, and she was put into that ministry, and that kind of ends your leadership aspirations, because you can't come out of managing MCFD looking good. Especially, you know, I was the union rep for social workers here in the north at that time, and it was rough. Like, you know, this is the ministry where the people going to work every day don't know whether they're going to walk into a house and find a dead baby. I mean, it's horrific stuff. The numbers never look good, but nobody said anything. Like, when the new government took power in 2017, Katrine Conroy, who's now the forest minister, she was given this ministry, and I thought, oh goodness, I mean, that poor woman. And she actually, like, she seemed to do pretty good, because nobody was really going after her big time. It might have been a deficiency of the opposition, I don't know. But even now, with the new minister there, you don't hear much from them, and I think it's because COVID is overshadowing things, but mental health and addiction is really overshadowing things. So it's just a way to illustrate that things are so bad in that area that even MCFD is, like, not been in the news lately. So it's these are the challenges that we're facing, and it's dominating the discussion in the House during Question Period.
I think validly so. It's one of those difficult things for those of us on the right. I think there is a lot of division amongst us around the question of safe injection or safe supply or the legalization of drugs. It squares a couple of different things, and it bumps up a few different places of value, right? And it's in not so many words, it's kind of like, well, nobody would want to see their own child in this position. Now, nobody would also want their child abandoned in that position, right? Addicted and homeless and everything else. And then the question becomes, well, what's the solution here? And that's where there is all this divergence, right? There are people who think there is a lot more we could do, or that, you know, some of these prescriptions, again, like safe injection sites or safe supply, might be the magical cure, or legalization and more therapy. But then there's also a certain segment of the right that believes that, no, we're just not punishing the right people. Maybe it shouldn't be visited upon just addicts or low-level people. It should be visited upon the kingpins. It should be visited upon people who are clearly moving this stuff. How do we keep drugs out of this country? We need to figure out border control. So there are these two sides. There's the side that I would say, and it's even within the religious right, I would say, right? Because on the religious right, there is definitely people who think that mercy is the way forward. And on the religious side, there's definitely people who think that punishment's the way forward. Right. And this is a hard question. It's a really hard question.
Yeah, it's one way to demonstrate sort of how fiery it is and how hot button an issue it is. I remember during just the 2020 election, during one of the televised debates of the leaders, Horgan made this statement, which most people probably didn't even think twice about, which was something to the effect of, the opioid crisis is a pandemic, but it's a bit different in the sense that it's self-inflicted. And immediately, after the leadership debates that are televised, the leaders will come out and do a bit of a scrum. The first thing he said was to apologize for that, because, as soon as he got off the stage, his handlers were on him saying, oh, you can't describe that as self-inflicted, right? Because there is that, and I would say it's probably the predominant view now within sort of the mental health agencies and addiction agencies, that they equate it as addictions with a mental health issue. So the purpose in doing that is to completely remove sort of any self responsibility for it, I guess, and any individual responsibility for it. And so I think that's the point of divergence, especially amongst those on the right. And it's, you can tell, this is quite a rabbit hole you can go down. And there's people, especially in Vancouver in the downtown east side, who this is what they do. I mean, because they live this every day, and literally, like, the majority of people that are dying every day are down in that, it's like a 6-block area. And they'll tell you that, like, I mean, they'll tell you adamantly the way to get through this is to provide a safe supply of the drug, which is what sort of put BC and Vancouver in particular on the opposite side of conservatives, especially at the federal level. I remember there was always this really weird gray period in Vancouver where the safe injection sites weren't technically legal. The dispensaries weren't technically legal, but Vancouver is under its own city charter. But the federal government under Harper at the time was vehemently opposed to this stuff. And so, if I think in that circumstance, if the VPD didn't exist, if there had been RCMP in Vancouver, you wouldn't have seen this stuff come up because I think they would have just rolled through and shut them all down. So what you can't really lie with, I guess, are the stats. And so the people that do this work, they will say, when you have safe injection sites, et cetera, it's more effective in getting people off the addiction. But I don't know, like even as a lefty and like, I'm certainly not religious. I'm not a faith-based person at all, but I still have a hard time completely removing any individual responsibility from that whole equation. And I get that once you're seized with an addiction, it controls you and it becomes a thing of its own. But, at some point you still have to take ownership of yourself despite the challenges that you face. And, when Horgan made that statement, like it didn't really strike me as controversial, but boy, he apologized for it fast. And it was just reflective of sort of the divergent views on this stuff. And it is literally the pandemic of note in British Columbia in particular, even more so than COVID, despite the difference of attention paid to each. So we'll see how that plays out. Let's try to move on to a slightly happier topic for some, maybe. And I don't usually like to talk about Vancouver politics, but there was something of note just yesterday. The very well-known Mark Marison, who, when I mentioned his name this morning, I think your response was who? He announced he's gonna throw his name in for mayor of Vancouver, which many of you are probably, who follow Vancouver at all, are probably saying, well, that's nothing of note. I mean, like, he and 250 other people have thrown their name in. But it's interesting because Mark Marison, for those who don't know, we're going to put a picture of him. I mean, if you read his bio, it's tough to really tell what he does. They tend to describe him as Christy Clark's ex-husband. That's sort of what I've seen, that like in the first sentence of most of the descriptions, which, I mean, that's at
least you're known as something, I guess.
Yeah, like there it is right there. Marison, the ex-husband of former Premier Christy Clark. I mean, like, fair enough. I think if it's just interesting, like if it was, if you turn the tables, if Christy Clark was a male and Marison was a female, and they had been married and then estranged, I don't think you'd see people describe Christy Clark as Mark Marison's ex-wife, right?
Yeah,
Or ex,
no, there's only one-way streets on these things. It's like how it's funny. Like, it's funny when it's said that, I hit, I kind of gave my husband a good punch on the shoulder for what he did or whatever. You try turning that one around. It's like, oh yeah, I gave my wife a good, like, even a very light love tap on the shoulder. Everybody's just like, that's not okay. And it's like, I'm not saying it would be okay. I'm just saying that, like, it's one of those one-way street things. It's an asymmetry between the sexes.
Well, if you ever punch me in the shoulder, I'll regard it as a love tap.
Oh, there you go.
That's for sure. So anyway, Mark Marison, he's like, how do you describe him? He's one of these backroom guys. He's a political strategist. He's a dealer, like a campaign manager. And he's one of these guys that's decided, and this happens every once in a while. Like Jeff Meggs from the NDP did the same thing. He was a backroom guy for years. And then he's not running for leadership of a party, but he ran for Vision City Council, got elected there. And there was always speculation that he also might run for mayor at one point. But he left city council to go become the chief of staff for the premier currently. It was also, I think, the chief of staff in the final days of the Glenn Clark government as well. But he's one of these rare examples of these backroom guys that actually do well. The other example on the left, I guess, was I remember somebody else mentioning this. It was Brian Topp was his name from the NDP. He ran for leader, did horribly. But Marison, I think from what I can tell, and I don't walk in BC Liberal circles, but I get the sense that he's a pretty divisive figure, even within BC Liberal circles, which is probably unavoidable if you're a strategist at that kind of level. You tend to be one of these guys that ends up making decisions that piss people off at some point. Mm-hmm. And so he's probably got a bit of this political baggage. But, just a few weeks ago, he was on the verge of getting into a real fight with Aaron Gunn, who's also looks like he's going to run for the leadership of the BC Liberal Party out of Victoria. who doesn't really come from that same BC liberal milieu, but he's got his own kind of insulated social media following, does his own videos and that kind of thing, and seems to be able to get himself into fights with the NDP all on his own. I recall just a couple
called a racist not so long ago.
Well, it was Katrina Chen, she's like the minister of childcare, which, you know, I mean,
it sounds like MCFD, but
it's I mean, the NDP created this ministry because they made a promise to create $10 childcare, which, you know, I mean, they've made there was a caveat in the province that it was a 10-year plan. So, I mean, that's a lot of terms of government to carry it out. But if they have a 10-year plan in government, it generally means it's never going to happen. So anyway, she tweeted like 3 weeks ago. I don't even know what Gunn said, but it was something to her response was, "I'm just going to say it. You're a freaking racist." Just straight out. And it was around the same time that guys like Mark Marison were making similar comments, not about racism, but to the effect of like, if this guy, I will do everything I can to stop this guy from taking over the Liberal Party. And I think Aaron Gunn's response was, I don't even know who this guy is. And the things that I've asked around about him, because he's shit talking me on social media, and nobody says anything good about him. But it's just this it never ceases to amaze me in Vancouver, and Vancouver's its own sort of political beast, right?
It is very strange.
Like they've got some very established political parties at the municipal level. The MPA's been around for, I don't know, like over 50, maybe over 100. I don't know how long, like forever. And but then there's other parties that sort of rise and fall based on the leadership candidate at the time. And so it's always kind of reminded me of South Korea, where they don't really have like established parties that with the exception of the MPA that are around for a long time. It's like this charismatic figure will rise, like, you know, the juice guy, whatever his name was, that was there for years. And this party will form around them. And then once they're gone, the party sort of just crumbles away and something else comes. So you've got all of these different parties that are starting to emerge, but they don't really run candidates. Like there's this outfit called Better City in Vancouver. And basically they're just looking to they want candidates to apply for their endorsement. And I'm watching, you know, their statements on the news. I'm just like, well, who are you? Like what? Like, you know, if I was a candidate, maybe I'd go for the endorsement because all endorsements are great. But as a voter, like, why would I follow your advice? And so it's sort of interesting to see this play out. The larger dynamic, of course, is that the current mayor didn't come from a party. He was kind of a coalition, like a loose-knit coalition. Kennedy Stewart, a former NDP MP out of Burnaby. And he's been polling in the tank the last little while. I think he's polling at about 30%, I think, which for Vancouver is pretty low for a sitting mayor. So it looks like, I mean, I think the election is like 18 months away yet, but if the election was held tomorrow, and there weren't a huge field of candidates to split the vote, similar to what happened last time, is a pretty good chance that his incumbency wouldn't help him at all. And so you're seeing all sorts of people come out of the woodwork. There was somebody, I think, who's on council named Nakagawa who announced yesterday. Mark Marison announced. There's a lot of speculation that Adrian Carr, who's a councillor from the Green Party, is going to announce. I've heard some speculation that Andrea Reimer, who's sort of a green-leaning former councillor of Vancouver, but I don't think she's really in the Green Party anymore. She might announce as well. So it's looking like it's going to be this big crowded field, almost like Toronto. And a guy like Mark Marison, I mean, it's just like him deciding that he's going to run is like, to me, it's this reflection of how divorced the backroom boys in political parties can become from the general electorate. Like
or the premier of the province, you know?
Yeah.
The other.
It's like, if you think that people want to vote for backroom political hacks, I mean, I guess we'll see. Maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe he'll sweep and do really well.
I think so this has always been a question, actually. It goes into meta levels of reflection here, right? Because ultimately, for example, whether you want to go as far back as the Old Testament and whether or not like the judges could be in charge or the prophets could be in charge, because eventually a king does come about. So why is there this separation between the theological sort of leadership and then the political leadership? There's a valid question. But coming back to even modern times, if you look at that, the fixers, the people who do the king making, often they can be king makers, but somehow they can't be kings themselves. it's an interesting dichotomy, right? It's this interesting divergence.
It's rare when it happens. Yeah,
it is rare.
It does happen, but
and at the same time, like maybe the idea is if you could almost cut out the middleman, because in a sense, like we think of the fixers as the middlemen, but they see the political candidates that they get involved, that they get elected as the middlemen. So I think maybe one of the ways that we can understand this is that like they're ultimately just trying to cut out the middlemen themselves, because they figure that they know enough about the branding, they know enough about how to write policy and talking points and things that are going to catch the eye, that how come they couldn't do it, right? And if they get a little bit of experience, they get a little bit of coaching and how to properly like look on the camera and like just do the right things, who cares, right? Like, of course they could do it themselves. Why do we need these good looking but vapid people? You know,
why should I have to filter my priorities through these puppets?
Yeah, these
that's what goes through their head.
Puppets, right?
Yeah, I could just do it myself. Well,
I'm the ventriloquist. Why don't I just do the act?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like what was that show? Curb Your Enthusiasm. Yeah, the guy who used to write for Seinfeld. I mean, apparently it worked for him. I never saw that show once, but people seem to like him. So we'll see if Mark Marison can reproduce this. But.
Yeah, and I mean, this is just it, right? Like we don't know what's going to come of it all. But I think that's an interesting move, right? And it's kind of the same thing even with what's happened with the pandemic, where like we have all these unelected bureaucrats making all these decisions and making all these announcements and making all these pronouncements about what's happening, and it's like what happened to leadership. So it's like the elected leaders have also cut out the middleman. They're like, no. I know I'm a middleman. Yeah. I know I don't have any expertise, and I'm just going to push this guy in front of me. And you take care of it. Yeah. And so where's the leadership? Where's the decisive? I'm in charge. I got elected. The buck stops here. Where is it? It's gone.
Well, and it's also, from my perspective, it's reflective of how our party structure has just sort of dominated the political discourse in the province, but also at the federal level. So in our system, it's like, I prefer the American system in the sense that I don't think in Canada we ever could have had somebody like Bernie Sanders or Trump, because neither of those guys came through the party ranks as people that were supported. And yet they both did very well despite their lack of support in their own milieu. And basically were, in the case of Trump, was able to take over that milieu. That wouldn't happen in Canada.
No,
I mean, it just wouldn't, because the parties have way too much power. And part of the reason they got power because of guys like Mark Marison who enforced that power within the party structure quite strongly from behind the scenes. So you end up with these MLAs on all sides that they are kind of like just vacuous, vessels for these backroom boys. And it's just funny when you see them sort of step out of the shadows to try to do it themselves. And it's satisfying to see them get trounced by the electorate. And I kind of hope that's what happens, but we'll see.
I want the shiny one. I want the shiny, dumb one. I don't want the smart, cynical one.
Now, before we run out of time, let's talk about air tax. This is the other,
the air tax.
This is the other piece.
The air tax.
The opposition's been.
This had thrown me for a loop. But I kind of understand it now. I legitimately, the first time I heard about this, I thought that we were talking about like a refund for all those Air Canada flights that got wrecked last year because of COVID. I mean, I lost about $800 in airplane tickets. I think WestJet's going to give you like a $300 credit. But the point is that, like there we are, right? Like I lost some money last year too, and I'm not getting any refunds for that.
Well, my wife's been trying to get me to go to Cuba for like the last decade. And I'm not that big on going to Cuba because, as you can tell, I burn in like 15 minutes. And so she finally, I didn't have enough other things to do to get out of it. And so we bought this ticket, and literally like the day before we were going to go, the restrictions happened. So we still got this flight to Cuba that's like a year and a half old, been sitting around. So I feel your pain, brother. But
fair enough.
Anyway, air tax. So
air tax. So that's not what it is.
That's not what it is. The opposition's been hammering. They've chosen to hammer the sitting government on this air tax. And so what this is, as some of you may know, I think it might have been last year, it might be a couple of years into this now. One of the first things the BC NDP government did was bring in what's called a speculation tax, which was quite divisive, especially for those who own property and multiple pieces of property, right? Like this speculation tax is applied to people who have second homes, which are not necessarily their primary residence. Yeah. So the idea is to try to put some downward pressure on the housing market to make it less lucrative to treat homes like a commodity. And this is, this might be somewhere where you and I diverge, and perhaps I see things different than the majority of the viewers, but from my perspective, but just to explain sort of what the air tax is. So you've got all these commercial properties that in Vancouver, they get converted to residential because it's really profitable to build these huge high-rise condos. And condos are flipped in Vancouver like commodities, like hotcakes. And it's literally what what pushes the prices into the stratosphere. It's one of the most expensive jurisdictions on the planet.
Yeah.
And you have these huge disparities where people that are working in Vancouver just can't live there.
No.
And so what's happened now, in addition to the speculation tax, is that those commercial properties that have all the space above them that's not built yet, they're getting taxed on that because it's residential. So they're trying to ridicule the government by saying, the opposition is, by saying you're literally taxing the air, like there's nothing there yet. But and some people, you know, especially if you've got a lot of property holdings, you're going to sympathize with that argument. My position on it is homes are homes. Part of the reason we've got a housing crisis in the Lower Mainland is because they're being treated as commodities. I've never had a lot of sympathy for people that make a living off of flipping houses because of the negative effects it has on the housing market and how difficult it makes it for younger people in particular to get into home ownership. I diverge from a lot of people on the left in this regard because they've given, I think too many people on the left have given up the prospect of home ownership. And part of it's because of their Marxist ideology, which is, and some of them are anarchists and they think that all property is theft, which I fundamentally disagree with. I think one of the ways to ensure that a working person has some level of autonomy from their employer is if they have a house that's not owned by a bank, so that, you know, if they have to go on strike, for instance, to fight for better conditions with their employer, they don't have this mortgage hanging over their head if they're not getting paid for a few weeks while they're on a picket line.
No, I agree on that, Ken. I actually have to explain this to boomers a lot, that houses are houses and they're not commodities. And I'm sorry, but you know, it's more important that maybe your children are able to live in your house, or that you can sell it to them like a friendly seller and get a good price for it, but something reasonable they can actually afford. And you just take whatever's left in the equity, and maybe that gets passed on for a rainy day to your grandchildren or great grandchildren. The point is that there is things to long for more than this life, and selling houses like hotcakes and flipping them around. It is. I think it's. I'm sorry. I'll go as far to say it's a sin.
Well, if you're buying multiple condos and using them as a commodity rather than a home,
yeah,
I don't care about your air tax whinging, and I never will. Like I'm sorry. Like if you're treating it like a business, then you're going to have to pay the tax on it because like there's a cost to the taxpayer for that condo going up.
But what about my little condo pets that I put in there? The little people that pay all my rents and utilities.
Tax them too.
I don't have time for that. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this is nonsense. People aren't hamsters. Like, you don't treat people that way. Like, just build houses that people can afford, and like have a population that has like a stake in the country. Like, this isn't rocket science.
No, that's right. And I just, you know, but it was reflective to me, and I felt like I should be a bit critical of the opposition here because I've spent a lot of time beating up the BC NDP, but it's reflective of where their priorities are. If you're gonna speak, if you're gonna spend all of your time advocating for, you know, these big property owners, a lot of them are commercial developers who are moving into the residential market instead of working folks. You may not get reelected, or you may not find yourself in government again. I mean, you really got to focus on where the priorities are and who's hurting and where the most votes are. Mm-hmm. Just before we leave, can we read this comment by W.A.C. Bennett?
Well, there's that. Yeah, there's we had that one. The market should be manipulated, or you afford to have a house, one of the basic necessities.
Yeah. There's a conservative line here that
absolutely. And to the point of the free market manipulation, you know what the best way is for nothing need to be interfered with government? Grow a conscience. Very simple. Grow a conscience, act ethically, have some semblance of morality, fear some kind of divine retribution, and walk with some humility. And if you do that, and you help your neighbor do that, and that guy, and that guy, and the guy after that, suddenly the government doesn't have to put its hands in everything because it has an ethical population that doesn't do dumb crap to each other.
There's one thing that before you kick me off, there's one thing I'll just leave people with who make this free market point quite often, which I think it's important. I mean, the free market has a role and it should not be restricted, but you can't move in that direction 100%. If you like, I remind people in Washington D.C., the Department of Trade building. Right, sort of in the National Mall there's this big stone statue outside of it. And let's consider the US like the bastion of free market ideology. But right outside the Department of Trade, there's this big stone statue that's been there since the inception of a huge horse, like a big stallion that's being restrained by this worker, because if he doesn't, the thing's going to drive off the cliff, right? And so the point there is, and they've understood this in the States, and we need to understand this as well, is that the free market is a powerful engine. Capitalism is a powerful engine. It creates wealth. It concentrates it into small hands. But if there isn't some restraint on it, you know, that horse is either going to fly right off the cliff, or it's going to keep eating oats until its stomach explodes. I mean, there has to be some balance there. And that's the point I like to leave people with. Thanks for letting me rant. I appreciate it.
No, we appreciate having you on. We're going to bring Stuart into the stream here. And if you want to stick around, you can. However you want to go. If you got to go, that's fine.
No, I don't have to go. I'd love to, but I'll try to keep my mouth shut because this guy is interesting.
Well,
hey, Aaron, good to see you.
So we've got Stuart Parker. It's good to see you. Of course, we're going to be chatting a little bit about, well, not even a little bit, of course, what's going on the left today and what's happening. Stuart Parker, of course, is the president of the Los Altos Institute, and he comes to us live from, we're actually all in Prince George today, so that's great. We're all in BC's northern capital, hopefully the future capital of BC, when they finally realize that the lower mainland isn't where it's at. Stuart, welcome to the program.
Well, it's great to be back. You separatists are a fun bunch. I'm glad to hang out here.
Starts with the word we're not supposed to use.
That word, I like it.
I don't know.
You just gave me the list of curse words. I didn't know that was. We need a supplemental list.
We're very strict about the style guide here.
No, it's silly. I mean, like, look, we're all BC boys in the room right now. It's funny because like over with my, and I'm not trying to denigrate my employer or anything. It just they very much is like, no, we're sovereignists, we're not separatists. I'm like, I don't look, man. Like, I just want Ottawa to leave me alone. I don't know what to say. Like, okay. Anyways, Stuart, what are we going to talk about today? What is going on in the left wing world that has you enraged today?
I don't think there's that much new. It's more just sort of fatigue. Did find myself in a fight yesterday because I went on Twitter to do with the Fairy Creek logging road blockade on Vancouver Island. So one of the things I noticed, and I first noticed it on your show on CFIS with your panel. Remember when, before COVID, we were having a crisis about a pipeline, and the different parts of the Wet'suwet'en people were taking different sides. It was all very complex. And your NDP guy was clearly getting like the talking points sent from Victoria. And one of the things he kept harping about was, well, this band government has said this and this band government has said this. So how can we really, who thinks what, who's to say, really? I interviewed the mayor of Sarnia and he says NAFTA doesn't apply here. So I guess we don't really know whether NAFTA applies. So there's one of the things that I've noticed is the provincial government is leaning heavily on this Indigenous people are divided talking point. Because apparently Indigenous people are bees or ants or some kind of hive consciousness, right? That if Indigenous people don't all have the same opinion, it's like a crisis. So I noticed that they hauled this out with the Fairy Creek logging road blockade, and the provincial government was like, well, see, a band council has passed a resolution in support of the blockade, in support of the logging. And the environmentalists come back and their faction on the reserve issues its own statement, an elder who backs the environmentalist position. And what I found really striking, and I'm really seeing this, I'll also talk a bit about the Burnaby North Seymour nomination race and how that fits into it. But so the apologists for the provincial government all come out and they say, well, the environmentalists have divided the community. It's like, well, I would think a logging road running through the middle of the community might actually more literally divide it. But then it's like, they should have sought prior consent. And I said, well, they're an environmental group. They're not a country. We don't have, you seem to think that nation to nation relationships are actually person to nation relationships and movement to nation relationships and NGO to nation relationships. But they really kept this up. And the idea was that if environmentalists had not been near the reserve, the normal hive consciousness of Indigenous people would have ensured the total unanimity about the logging of Fairy Creek. And we noticed, and so there's this real sense on the part of, I won't call it the NDP. I think the NDP exploits it, but I don't think the NDP is it at the higher levels. But I think a lot of sort of progressive or woke consciousness is about depriving racialized people of any agency at all. Of
That's
saying,
right.
well, this person's an Indian, so they must agree with the other Indians, or this person is an Indian, they must be at one with the forest. And we're seeing this in the fairly surprisingly competitive race for the federal candidate who will succeed Sven Robinson as the NDP's standard bearer in the Burnaby North Seymour riding. And again, so I've been sucked into this race because Mark Eel Simpson is the perfect identitarian NDP candidate. He is the co-chair of their Black, Indigenous, and Persons of Color Committee, which advises some part of the party that doesn't listen to it, that then advises the government that doesn't listen to the party. But the point is, people all. Yeah.
I can tell you that's absolutely true. That there's no link between what these committees come up with and what the party actually.
No, and I think any intelligent person is aware of that. But anyway, he's the co-chair of this committee, and he launched his campaign to be the nominee. And I got a call from probably one of the longest term Black activists in the party. Right, I come from the. I've been doing sort of, Black community politics in BC for years. I opened Black History Month for Vancouver in '94 because I'm from the Jerome family. And anyway, long-term activist, been with the party for 50 years, said, well, I read the newspaper story, and as far as I can tell, his main achievement is being biracial. I'm not sure that being biracial is itself an achievement. But what pulled me in was the fact that he'd stated that his political role model was my Uncle Harry. But of course, he had never read anything about my Uncle Harry's political opinions or affiliations. Because what made him admirable was that he too was a biracial man who lived in North Vancouver. Yeah. So I came in, first of all, because I like Sven, and these people were giving Sven some pretty serious guff. And second, I said, look, you should be concerned that an NDP candidate is seeking the nomination because, and telling you that his role model is the Social Credit Party's multicultural communities organizer from 1972 to 82, the close friend of Grace McCarthy, the right-wing populist deputy premier, and a frequent guest in the home of Jerry Strongman, the Socred health minister from North Vancouver. But of course, the response was that obviously my Blackness is not inscribed on my body, and therefore it doesn't really exist in my blood. And so the BIPOC Twitter brigade from the Young Identitarians of the NDP decided that their counter-argument was that I was not my mother's son. It was not, maybe Mark Hill should admire someone who was actually left-wing, who didn't have a personal vendetta against the NDP for the last 10 years of their life. But again, the assumption is, oh, this person's skin is Black. I guess they must be left-wing. I guess I therefore admire them. And it's this reduction of any racialized person into a single stereotype or cartoon. And
yeah,
it just, anyway.
For the viewer, Stuart, just remind us, what was it that Sven said that sort of sparked this off? Because I remember reading the Twitter comment, and it was pretty, it wasn't a lot. He basically just said, look, I don't know this guy. He endorsed the other candidate. I don't know.
Yeah, whom he knows. Jim Hansen's a good man. Jim Hansen is exactly the kind of person the NDP should be on its knees in front of. He has really, he's somebody the party should be working hard to hold on to, because they really hurt him on bringing in no-fault auto insurance. Jim fought against that for years. But what happened was Mark Eel's supporters, the young Black candidate, they said, I can't believe Sven Robinson isn't supporting Mark Eel, that he's supporting a cisgender heterosexual white man. And, this just shows that the old white men of the NDP are all in this together. It's no, Sven Robinson was a political prisoner of the Harcourt government. Thank you very much. I don't think they're all in it together. But they then said, so Sven, why, you've told us why you like Jim, why aren't you supporting Mark Heel? And then Sven said, well, he's never come to a meeting. He's been a member of the party for 2 years. And when I ran in this riding as the candidate last time, he neither donated nor worked on my campaign. And the response was, how dare you criticize him? How dare you say, don't you know he's only 26 years old? Like, don't you know that he's just like a young man starting out? And Sven's like, I won a competitive nomination for a winnable seat when I was 25. That's how my career started.
Wasn't he? Yeah. Now, I was surprised because I expected that Sven was going to apologize right away, because that's sort of how this stuff plays out if you're going to survive in wokeness. And you know, like, I mean, Sven's been around a long time. I got some respect for him in terms of what he's achieved. I don't revere him to the same degree I think that you do. I've disagreed with him on a number of things. Like I was never a Leap Manifesto guy. I always thought what was the name of the sort of the second waffle that him and Libby were involved in?
Oh, the New Politics Initiative. Even I split with him on that one. That was a dumb plan.
Yeah, just and kind of unrealistic. But those aside, I mean, you have to respect that. The guy was sort of a human rights icon in BC. He was, to my knowledge, the first openly gay man to be elected
in the Commonwealth.
In the Commonwealth, yeah. So I mean, he's. Then there was the whole incident in the ring and stuff, which we won't talk about. I mean, I didn't really hold that against him. People F up, but I thought, if you've sort of put yourself into this environment and then this happens, which it inevitably does, because, as everybody knows, just before you came on, we were talking about this Better City Coalition in Vancouver, which is sort of like a political party, but they're just inviting mayoral candidates to endorse them. And I just saw this one representative from it who got on the tube. It didn't say really what his name was. He just identified himself as a proud gay man, and sort of said, like, this is what I like about Better City, is because guys like me get to present this stuff. And I'm thinking, haven't you got the memo, man? Like, white gay guys are way too low on the hierarchy of oppression now. Like, you're in the same boat as me, bud. Like nobody cares anymore. So I kind of thought, like, all of Sven Robinson's achievements in the past sort of have faded away. So in order to survive, I figured he was going to have to apologize and prostrate himself in front of everybody. I'm proud to see that he hasn't done that. Like, unless
he just never does. He's not that kind of man. That's why a lot of people who did not agree with him voted for him and trusted him, because they knew that he was willing to make extraordinary sacrifices to keep telling the truth. That there was no price, and that's why he had he represented a very Christian riding when he was the only openly gay MP. And it got more Christian as the proportion of Korean immigrants moving in. And he, pulled those people on side. So I knew that Sven wouldn't apologize. It's one of the reasons I was so glad when he got back here, because I could see that his collision with the present day NDP was inevitable. Some people think that the present day NDP is like epitomized in Sven Robinson, but it's really not, because Sven might have been mainly a social issues activist in terms of the issues he took on, and not as much of an economic issues guy. But the point was, it all came down to a physical reality for him, right? When it's time for Sue Rodriguez to use the assisted suicide thing, he was there to get hassled by the police. When it was time to oppose logging in Clackwood Sound, he was there getting himself arrested, put in prison. So Sven, I think, really understands that there's like a real world, a real physical world in which events actually take place. And that's the side he's going to come down on, not a lot of very strange nonsense rhetoric.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Twitter is becoming this world, right? Where supposedly, I guess you can get canceled. Like, if people can come find you and attack you and get your job taken away.
Do you know anything about this, Stuart?
Yeah, actually, finally, my employer just revealed in the negotiations last week that it was like, no, we're not taking Stuart Parker back. Sure, he had a breakdown, but that's not what this is really about. And my lawyer's like, what is it really about? And what Stuart says on Twitter. I think that's a pretty stupid, bald-faced admission to make to a person like me, because I'm not totally unlike Sven. I haven't exactly had the successes that he's had, but I can't bear to let that argument go, that remark go unreported. But the thing is, what this remark also points out is that Twitter by itself can do nothing. Cancellation comes from the intersection of powerful social media platforms with big HR. Yeah. And the values of wokeness, right? The belief that gender is a consumer choice, but race is inevitable, indelible, and inherited. All these strange ideas, they don't come out of like the weirdo left. I mean, the weird left has come up with some weird stuff. They come out of HR. The ideas, the central values, if you want to see where they show up first in writing, they show up in documents produced by Harvard School of Business high-level managers in large firms. And so you've got to recognize you don't just need Twitter. Twitter can strike the match. It can light the flame. But we live in a society in which everybody has an implied morals clause in their contract now. And the people who actually do the canceling are your boss or the judge controlling your custody of your kids. Or, it's the people who can actually bring down the hammer. The fact that bringing down the hammer on people can now be legitimated simply by like anonymous 16-year-olds saying mean things on Twitter, that's insane. But that's what the HR industry, that's been its agenda for the past 30 years. And that agenda is just proceeding. A lot of people, of course, do this work and they think of it as social justice activism. Right? The big wokester on the UNBC faculty, he's out there during these negotiations calling me a misogynist on social media if I say I like too many books written by men or, whatever it is. And what I finally had to say to this guy is like, there was a word for people who maintained employee blacklists for the bosses, who circulated rumors for the boss, who colluded with the boss to fire coworkers they didn't like. And that word is scab.
I've heard that
These
before.
People are scabs. And the idea, and somehow wokeness is about turning scabbing into social justice activism.
Well, it's confirming to hear you say some of this stuff. Look, I negotiated collective agreements both in the private sector and the public sector for years. And, the one thing that I've thought about recently when I was sort of reviewing that history is whenever we were like the issues that when you're at a bargaining table that the employer is going to oppose, right? It's always wage increases, obviously, because it costs money. The stuff they never opposed, and in fact, often would propose, would be the diversity stuff, the anti-bullying stuff. And from the union perspective, and I have to take responsibility for this because I was involved in it as anybody was. We always invited those kind of things. Like we always wanted the anti-bullying language that was, that brought in all different other ways that the employer could basically whack at an employee over the head with the contract. So the collective agreement started to become this like punitive instrument against workers that it was supposed to defend. And And we figured out far too late. And to be honest with you, I think the labor movement still hasn't, I don't think unions have figured this out yet. That this is definitely a tool that employers use, not only to as a bat against employees, but they use it as a bat with which employees can beat each other over the heads with. And so in my time working for unions, I noticed this big shift between having to defend workers against charges from unions, against charges from the employer, to this new role where we had to defend workers against charges from other union members. And so the union becomes sort of this intermediary piece, trying to mediate through this stuff, because employers are all too happy to just sort of step aside and be like, you guys fight it out amongst yourselves.
Internal division.
Oh yeah, no. And that's exactly how it's been used, because, and this is the effect that identitarianism has either on the left or the right, is it's an insidious infestation that teaches people to be racist. And I like the point you made at the outset that the big defense that identitarians had against those of us who would call them racist was, well, there's no such thing as reverse racism. Yeah, I get that. We didn't come up with that term, actually. Like, the left identitarians came up with it, and they had to come up with this idea of reverse racism because they had to deal with this contradiction that emerged as soon as they established that you could make determinations about people based on the color of their skin and where they come from and their identity. And it's actually not white people that I think they're racist against. It's people of color that they're racist against, precisely because of what you said at the outset, which is they reduce people of color, First Nations people, Black people, South Asian folks in British Columbia. They reduce them all to this common denominator and assume they're all the same. You hear this in the States a lot, where they talk about the Black vote, for instance, right? And totally, disregard the record number of Black voters for Trump this last election. I mean, it still wasn't a majority, but it's increasing. Huge numbers of Latino voters for Trump, for instance, right? So, but there's it just doesn't compute, because they think, well, if you're not white, then you must be this type of person that I think you are. And they really reduce them to this common denominator, and it's bloody racist. It is absolutely racist.
Thomas King had that great start to one of his books. It's just entitled "The Indian You Had in Mind," right? Because he's like, I am not the Indian you had in mind. But I think that we've got to remember that there's been a lot of churn, right, in what we think of as the left. Like, the left is mostly like a developmental stage of children of the privileged. It's like, we didn't used to think that kids at Brown University were the left just because they had a lot of time on their hands and liked protesting things. Like, we used to think that there was something material about it. And one of the things that is a common way of showing power, there are some ways that white people since the Enlightenment have used to show white supremacy. One is sensitivity, right? The more sensitive you are, the more that redounds to your glory, right? Justin Trudeau's big debate coup when he pulled ahead in the 2015 election was a coup achieved by telling Tom Mulcair that Mulcair had hurt his feelings because he talked about how his dad had handled the FLQ crisis. And so that's like, oh no, I guess we can't talk about like a major military operation because we might hurt this man's feelings over here. So that cultivation of sensitivity is one important thing. But one of the, so Canadian immigration, starting in the 1920s, like the rest of the world, cut off non-white immigration in 1926. Most countries in the global north did, and only let white people in. And by the 1950s, Canada was one of the first countries to change that policy, but they did it in a very targeted way. They created nanny visas. The nanny visa comes out of the 1950s, and it was a visa that was demanded by the wealthy Laurentian elite. And it was because there weren't enough Black people in Canada to fill all of the public domestic service jobs in a really big house. And part of showing your status as a white person is your ability to put exotic looking non-white bodies around you in a subservient position. It's like an art form. It's like, look at this exotic looking person here. Look at this exotic looking person here. That's what the photos are coming out of the identitarian left. This is about white people curating who is around them like it's an art project. And they're trying to make this beautiful picture. And your power, right, in a racist society as a white person is primarily demonstrated by your ability to control non-white bodies and where they go and what they do. And I don't really see this as very different. One of the features of not punching down is that when a person of lower status in the grand progressive calculus of relative oppression, the neoliberal chain of being, where we're not sure what to put higher, or cetaceans or Mexicans, It's like, are dolphins better than Mexicans? I just don't know who's more oppressed. When they're doing that, it's punching down to disagree with or taught back to a non-white person if you're white. So what this effectively means is that non-white people can say whatever they want, but only white people have the privilege of being answered. So it's a clever thing, right? Chris Rock put it very well, very crudely in the 90s. Sure, I'm allowed to say the N-word all day, and you're allowed to raise interest rates. Want to trade?
Yes.
No, and that's a very fair point. The question of actual empowerment, or what, or who actually has a stake in the political say of the country, how the country's supposed to progress. I think coming back to what's going on to the Fairy Creek situation, is there is something I think that has to kind of be discussed, and it's almost the elephant in the room that we're all kind of dancing around even at this moment, is that, as far as I know, and I don't know a lot about it, there are people on either side that are, obviously I have a status card. Some of the people there would have a status card. Some of them wouldn't have a status card, but they would have it in their blood. That doesn't matter. The point is that there are people on both sides of this issue who are supposedly, of Indigenous descent, or a status Indian like myself, if you want to use the word Indian. And the point is that with that kind of division, and with the amount of politicization that's happened around race in this country, and it's happened around everything else, how are we supposed to move forward? And how are people supposed to settle these disputes if everything's already captured in that way? If race is already captured, if the lawyers already have you on speed dial, if the Supreme Court's going to weigh in before you have a chance to say go, how do you allow for, regardless of even the environmental question, though we can get there in a moment, Stuart, I promise, how do you allow for this group of people who we've said now have the freedom and the autonomy to do what they will economically, etc.? How do we take that group of people and just let them be, and let them argue this out themselves without it suddenly becoming a huge political rigmarole?
Yeah, I don't think there's a way. I think that we have to recognize that we live in systems that intersect, and there's no way out of that. There is no easy way out of the fact that we live in systems that intersect. I think that, I think that it wouldn't matter, right? If you were in any part of the world where there was a consequential ecological or fossil fuel development issue, money moves around internationally, and money and advocates are going to show up in your community. And I think the key thing is, right now, we have an asymmetry with the advent of benefits agreements. And I think what we need to do is address that asymmetry. We can't insulate Indigenous communities any more than we can insulate our own communities from global debates that always have local manifestations. What we can do is put communities in a situation where they're not so economically precarious and economically insecure that they are not really making, they're making a choice under duress. There's a lot of accepting benefits agreements that are sold within an Indigenous nation, not as, hey, here's the great project we've decided to approve, but hey, this thing is going through anyway, so we tried to get a cut. I think that sense that the project will proceed no matter what, and all you can do is try and get a cut, that it debases our debates, and it points to a larger material problem, which is that, and we all know this, that as long as on-reserve Indigenous communities are primarily supported through block grants from the federal government and not from the community control of the resources around them, people are going to operate in a climate of intimidation. And it would be far better to turn that money into extensions of reserve boundaries and extensions of the mineral rights under those reserve boundaries and the timber rights above the surface. Communities will have an easier time making big decisions when they're economically secure. And we know that from anywhere.
So, I mean, this is a dynamic that exists outside of First Nations communities as well. It's sort of an age-old dynamic in smaller communities in particular. But I wonder, like viewers from Alberta, for instance, I mean, I pose this question to them. Are jobs derived from a project enough? That's sort of the question, because this is always the argument in favor of these projects, many of which I agree with. But are like that they're going to generate family supporting jobs, et cetera. But the jobs only exist in the large form during the construction phase. And then there's many, depending on the project, like Site C, for example, there's just not as many people required to run Site C as there are to build it. It's the same with a pipeline for sure. So like, what else should the taxpayer who's having to, fund any subsidies that are going towards that project? In the case of pipelines, we now own one federally, so we've taken on the liability for that. But are the jobs derived from that project enough? Like, what other way should a community be able to benefit? And I like this example you've posed of what's happening in First Nations communities. Wet'suwet'en incident was a perfect example where you had this real difference between the sort of the elected Indian Act Council versus some of the, not all, but some of the hereditary leadership who were vehemently opposed to it. And, I've said before, for what I would regard as rather nuanced reasons and probably quite different from your own, Stuart, I was in support of the Coastal GasLink pipeline, but not in support of it being imposed on the leadership of that area, of the hereditary leadership of that area, which has traditional jurisdiction outside of the reserve, essentially. And so and part of the reason, I think that they were opposed to it was, I mean, there were environmental concerns which drove their opposition, but part of their opposition, I think, was also like, getting a cut of the proceeds is not necessarily enough. Like, if this thing's going to go through our land, like, why can't we own it?
And I think we've got good examples of that from the Columbia River Treaty, right? If we look at West Kootenay Power that was created through when they did the Columbia River dams, right, that administers, that's local power controlled by local communities. And it also generates Columbia Basin Trust money that goes all over the region that does these things. So normally, if there's something that's producing an annuity, right, effectively, because it's doing the same thing every year, whether you're running water through a dam or gas through a pipeline or whatever, the Columbia Basin agreements really show pretty solid models for how communities are cut in, not just during the construction phase, but every year that the utility operates. And I think that we don't have to reinvent the wheel there. What we have to do is look at, well, there was some extraordinary leadership that was highly, I would say it was W.A.C. Bennett at his most nationalist. Certainly Glenn Clark ran a very nationalist government, an economically nationalist government, at least in its rhetoric, didn't always follow through on the ground. But when he renegotiated the Columbia Basin treaties, those things were all souped up. And I think that we can have forward-looking leadership on things like that. I mean, I think that fundamentally what people want is some level of stability in their economy, the ability to know that a job is going to be there. And the trapping jobs that were disrupted by CGL are an example of how we cash in long-term jobs for short-term jobs. That when we clear cut on a slope, when we do these things that produce these temporary windfalls, they do that at the expense of a long-term sustainable job. And British Columbians are having trouble learning how to hold on to things. It's not a thing we have any practice with. We were a province that was founded to extract raw materials from. We have been shipping out logs from from BC overseas since 1843 on the commercial market, and since the 1790s within the British Imperial Navy's market. And we will make these stabs at thinking about long-term economic security, and then they'll go out the window when the next big windfall appears.
Yeah. So in that case, I guess, and I know that you've noted this before, at least to me privately, that something that appeals to you about the Scandinavian model is the idea that they have heritage funds, and they have, of course, large sovereign funds to try and keep their economies stable in times of crisis. Is that essentially what would have to happen then in British Columbia? And then as a segue there, such sovereign funds or such, like having heritage funds, and is that a way for the West to conceive of itself as like, well, we're going to actually create an equitable place for our own citizens. It's not just, we're not just being exploited by Ottawa. Our citizens are being exploited in the systems we have. How do we make a more equitable system moving forward?
Well, I think the first thing you'd want to know is, how did Alberta blow its heritage fund, right? Because that was created by Peter Lougheed during the second oil boom. Money flowed in, and they managed to not just empty it, but for a while use it as an instrument to borrow more money in order to further indebt themselves. So I don't trust a lot of, I think we'd need to see a real change in our political system before I would want to trust a long-term succession of provincial governments with managing funds like that. That's why I often point to the Mexican land reform model, where you decentralize this. And that is what the Columbia Basin treaties did, right? It pulled these communities like Brilliant along the Kootenay River out of BC Hydro. And it created wealth there, and then the community could defend it. Whereas right now, I feel like a government could get in by a landslide here, be in for 5 years, really start to screw up. I might be describing the current one, and then try and buy its way out at the end. And those funds, there's very little legal way to protect them from an irresponsible government, except to never give it to that government in the first place.
That sounds pretty conservative of you, Stuart.
Oh, it's original Green Party. I'm reverting to like my pre-1993 politics or something. I don't know.
Well, this is also this is the reality of British Columbian politics. I think in other jurisdictions they sort of describe it as the realignment, but it's always kind of been the way here, where it's tough to sort of identify whether somebody's a conservative, a green, or a socialist or otherwise, because we don't necessarily look like those archetypes in different jurisdictions. And I think the three of us probably individually all exemplify that to some degree.
And something I'll jump off on there, Stuart, too, is that going back to that other, I host a bunch of shows now. This is all getting out of hand. Going back to what happens on the local radio here, that was one of the things that really blew me away. Our token curmudgeon conservative, somewhat Archie Bunker type, was talking about reconciliation and needing to speak to the people and trying to find a way forward with the wet sweat. And meanwhile, the two social democrats were like, send in the army.
It totally was. And all the stereotyping we kept expecting out of your pro-Trump conservative ended up coming out of the New Democrat and the Liberal. It was very, very telling. And I've got to say, Eric Allen went even further than that. Like, Eric Allen was like the conservatives before they were conservatives. It's like, we made an agreement in 1763. We didn't keep our word. We were supposed to sign a treaty. We've screwed ourselves here. It's theirs. It's like, we screwed up. We didn't follow our own rules, and we didn't keep our own agreements. So it was very interesting, because what he was talking about, in a funny way that I do find myself identifying with my uncle's social credit politics, but also with Sven Robinson's politics, is that he was operating from a theory of honor, that he was using like honor as his master sort of structure for how he talked about what should happen politically. And it's jarring, right? It's jarring to hear people say, well, yeah, you should keep your promises and help your friends and like all these things that we think are human virtues. And yet, mysteriously, we don't esteem them as political virtues. And it should hardly surprise us when there's that incongruence.
Maybe switching gears a little bit, but there's something I've been meaning to ask you. I heard your show, I think it was earlier this week, or maybe it was an interview you did with Smithy down in Vancouver, but you ended up
Oh, yeah.
making, which was good, I thought, but it made the case that what ultimately brought the Glenn Clark government down was his decision to try to essentially do what we were talking about in the opening session, try to rekindle the shipbuilding industry in British Columbia. But you were active at a time when Clayoquot Sound was also really, becoming a major issue and sort of a defining issue for the green movement in British Columbia, and in particular in opposition to the NDP government. So I wonder, is that head going to come out again as a major problem for the NDP government? Do you think it's going to be something that's going to rekindle unity amongst green to the same extent that it did? No,
No, I think that the identitarianism that has been unleashed among political troublemakers, right? Troublemakers have been targeted with identitarian ideologies. They've been piped into people's minds through social media. So whether it's like white grievance politics on the right, or whether it's diversity identitarianism on the left, the point is that I think our social movements are in dire straits. They don't have the capacity to operate in solidarity with any extended period of time. And I think we have to acknowledge that a bunch of work has been done on us. I don't know why we thought that it was in the financial interest of Silicon Valley billionaires that we'd be able to organize effectively against their system. Like, why would we ever have thought that? So social media has amplified and accelerated pre-existing trends that have fractured all these coalitions. And I think if new coalitions come forward, they will look unlike anything in the past. I don't think there's any way to go back to the past and have the urban cultural left siding with the rural labor left again. I think that's done. What we have to do now is forge coalitions of people who do have a critique, who are capable of that. So I think the other thing is we have to remember what NDP governments are for, or what third way governments are for, whether it's Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, Mike Harcourt, whoever. The reason capital looks the other way and lets its newspapers give favorable coverage to these parties and lets its lobbyists be nice to these parties is because they've been trying to get something done and the local right-wing toadies haven't been able to deliver it. But Christy Clark couldn't deliver LNG Canada for Royal Dutch Shell. It took a premier who had once publicly boycotted Royal Dutch Shell in order to give Royal Dutch Shell enough money to make them show up here. And so the reasons, when you see a jurisdiction and you see the mainstream press like being nice to Social Democrats, it's because they figure the Social Democrats are the only ones who can actually deliver the results they want. So they're going to keep those people in office until those results are delivered. And, then they'll hammer them back into the dust later. You see this? It's a tried and true system.
Yeah, no, we see this dynamic sort of at a microcosm level play out in the labor movement over and over again. I remember growing up watching my parents go to union meetings. I've still got this. I think I've even told you about this in the past. I've still got this old video from, I think, 99 or something, or whenever, just before Dosanjh got decimated and the NDP was knocked down to 2 seats. There's this old convention video of I've just blanked on his name now. He passed away. John Shields, who was the president for years of the biggest public sector union in BC, the BCGEU, delivering this scathing critique of Glenn Clark, saying, if you don't have our support, you're going to lose the election. And by the way, you don't have our support. And it was just a scathing critique, the likes of which you didn't see from Labor. And it was interesting watching that, because my parents, who were, big fans of that particular individual within that milieu, they didn't vote for the NDP in that election either, even though they'd sort of been lifelong NDP supporters. And part of their complaint was that, by the second term, that unions had sort of fallen back on their role of criticizing government to the benefit of working people, because there was kind of this formal and unholy alliance between unions and the NDP, that once they got in power, it was very difficult to criticize them. And I'm starting to see, that this history repeats itself, obviously. And now that we're into the second term of the NDP government, you're starting to see lots of evidence of that percolating around. It's easier to identify now because, back in those days, there were internet forums, but unions didn't run official internet forums, and there was no Twitter and there was no Facebook. And now you can hear what comes out of the mouth of a union leader, and then you can go to Twitter or Facebook and you can see what union members actually think. And it's usually quite a bit different, especially when it comes to support for a politician. And you're seeing all sorts of criticism, especially out of the teachers union right now, the BCTF. We were talking in the opening segment about how sometimes in the cabinet assignments for a new government, whoever gets a certain ministry, you can tell that was the person that the premier didn't like very much. And usually it was whoever got MCFD and whoever got education. It was somebody that, they saw as a threat, for instance.
Oh yeah, the Ministry of Dead Kids and the Ministry of Living Kids.
That's right. And so, you look at Rob Fleming, for instance, who, at one point was quite an up and comer in the BC NDP milieu. I think it would be very difficult now for him to ever launch a leadership bid, say if Horgan doesn't run again, because he's got this, he had the education ministry for a term, and it's very difficult to sort of come out of that when you've got one of the biggest unions. There's 60,000 teachers in British Columbia who are all members of this union. Most of them have on average like 6,000 Twitter followers. I've noticed they're very active, and they've just been beating this guy up for a long time. So it's interesting to, and their main complaint is, even with their own leadership at points, you have to be able to criticize this government. We don't care if there's a link. And this is a union that doesn't have a direct link to the NDP. They're not affiliated, for instance. So you're starting to see that come up again. And it'd be interesting to see in this age of social media where you can see what workers are saying directly, how the NDP is going to sort of deal with that, and whether it's going to knock them off course at all, because it hasn't in the past to their detriment.
And I would argue that, again, we'll see just a shadow of what we saw in the 90s. And the reason is that in the 90s, a bunch of things were just getting going that have now finished happening. And one has to do with this new kind of, I would call it like a social justice manager class. It's a kind of professional who sometimes is the vice president of a trade union, sometimes is writing a report for KPMG, sometimes is a major PR firm consultant, and is sometimes a deputy minister.
Yeah, right.
And is sometimes, and this is the crucial part, the executive director of a blue chip environmental or social justice organization. So you have to recognize these characters like George Heyman, they rotate through all of these things representing the same class interests, which is in silencing actual effective dissent. So that class was something that Mike Harcourt was, this is before Tony Blair's even elected. We haven't spun off enough government services to be delivered by the nonprofit and charitable sector yet for those executive director packages to start looking really good. But pretty soon, you're going to have all of these, decent six-figure senior jobs in the nonprofit sector as well as these other sectors. And I think that it's the people who are outside of that system of control who are going to be able to effectively push back against this government. I think that the term captured is a very useful one. And I would argue that, like mainstream political parties, most major trade unions and most major civil society organizations are captured by this class at this time.
Yeah, that's an interesting insight. I was astounded, after 2017, watching the NDP come to power again, how many people that, had been these social justice activists in various capacities suddenly got plum jobs as lobbyists for firms that we had previously reviled. And there was this big hiring spree because suddenly, all these lobbying firms, they had no NDP representatives, and suddenly, and they didn't predict that there was going to be an NDP government necessarily, so they had to start hiring all these social justice activists, and they did. And so you're, like, I was living in Vancouver at the time, so you'd be going out to brunch with these folks, and suddenly they're lobbyists all of a sudden, and so, like, that changes the conversation somewhat. And it's just amazing to see how they just move in and out of these different milieus with like no detriment to their conscience whatsoever, and they just don't see the irony, and they don't understand why suddenly people are criticizing them. This is probably the second time I've mentioned McLean Kay. He's going to have to sponsor us here at some point. He's the chief editor of the Orca. He was having this off the record conversation with an NDP staffer in some ministry just the other day, and he promised not to mention their name, and nor should he. But they were angry about this C-bus memes guy that's making all these funny memes. He has been for quite a while, and they were angry that they were all directed at and really scathing of the NDP government, and they just didn't understand why he was going after them instead of the Green Party or the BC Liberal opposition. And Kay kind of looked at them, and he's like, because you're government, like, you just don't like. Of course they're going to go after you, but there's this cognitive dissonance. They just don't.
You're the man.
Well, I think that for many who join a certain kind of uncritical social justice politics, they develop this idea very early that there are two groups of people in the world: the people who are responsible for things and the people who hold others responsible for things. And they're the people who hold others responsible for things, which means they can't be responsible for anything because they're not that kind of person who's responsible for things. I watched that play out in the coalition of progressive electors when no one would resign over the fact that the party solicited and received donations from real estate developers under the table during one election. And they were just baffled because all of them were at each other trying to find the villain, not understanding that the people who had made the decision were the villain. They were on this like search for themselves that was just not going to succeed. So I think that there's a larger problem. Again, it's a cross-partisan problem. So much of what we hear in conservatism now is about people not being able to control themselves, or people, not being responsible for something they benefited from. And it's like, well, no, you didn't do the thing. You just benefited from it. That's what we mean by responsible. So, pay it back, deal with it. Or, so I really think that it's a society-wide malaise that people just, we can now expect that every apology will be insincere. We haven't reduced the number of apologies. We've increased the number of apologies. But I don't think anybody's sincerely apologizing for anything. I'll never forget that moment when that commentator said to Justin Trudeau, "So are you going to be apologizing to Jody Wilson-Raybould today?" And he said, "No, but I do have an Inuit apology scheduled for 4 p.m.
It's all the same. It'll all work out in the end. I think kind of as maybe a way to cap it all off here, Stuart, is this idea of honor and bringing that back. It was interesting because somebody had commented not so long ago about this, the idea that I had put forward there, that growing a conscience was somehow altruistic, or even somehow, I don't know, castigating me as being left wing or something. I just kind of sat there. I was like, no, I think growing a conscience is kind of a fundamental human responsibility. And so having a conscience and having a sense of honor, and for that matter, I think that it's not just about empathy versus competency. I think that morality is competency.
Yeah, and I think that It's one of the things that the term social justice deprived us of. It was there are some words that just carry a tremendous amount of damage inside them, because social justice, everybody believes in social justice. Nobody thinks that they want unjust things. Everybody thinks that their theory of justice is correct for society. And what the term social justice does is it causes people on the left to lose imaginative empathy, because they never have to ask, how is the person I'm fighting good according to themselves? Why does the person I'm fighting think that they're the good guy? And on the right, the reaction has been, well, this is an insult. I'm not even getting into this debate. You're suggesting that I believe in injustice. So screw you, conversation over. And I think that we can actually have rational arguments about which theory of justice is better. Once upon a time, that's what politics was. It wasn't like announcing strange bullet point lists of things that everyone knows aren't going to happen, and then wander around firing different minor campaign officials all day for the latest off-message thing they said. Like, that's an election now. Here's my brainstorm bullet point list. Now let's see how few firings I'll have to perform.
No, it's a fair point. It's a fair point. We're coming to the end of our time here. I want to say thank you again, Stuart, for coming on. It's really good to have you here. I hope you remain a constant on our Thursdays to help us see things from that other perspective and help us build a coalition for change in this province, in this region, and for the communities at large that need a benefit, need to see things improve. So thank you for being with us today, Stuart.
It was my pleasure. I'll have better curtains next time. See you all later.
As long as it's not curtains for you.
There you
And we should also thank all of the viewers who have been quite active. We've had this comment stream going. Sorry, we can't post them all, but all really good stuff. And it's just great to see everybody so active and
yeah, absolutely. But again, we're thankful to have comments, and every now and again we can address them as strongly as we can. Sometimes we kind of get into the middle of what we're doing in here, so we'll do our best throughout this time. But again, thank you for watching the show and being a part of the program, and thank you for being on this Thursday.
Great fun.
Of course, we're not back. That is to say, Mountain Standard Time isn't back until next Tuesday. We are always on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursdays from 9 to 11 Pacific Standard Time. We call ourselves Mountain Standard Time, but it's Pacific Standard Time is our timings. Or, of course, 10 to 12 Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in Mountain Standard Time in Alberta. So thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week.